Welcome back. In this episode, it's all about mesh lights. Mesh lights are those things that are light sources, much like the light objects we've just discussed in the previous episode, but it's surface areas that are emitting light. So usually on a 3D object, you can have either one surface that covers the whole object, or you could have different types, like this could be defined as rubber, and this could be defined as shiny white plastic, or if it's a piece of clothing, you could have a metal-y kind of belt buckle, and so forth. So all that is possible, and that's usually done when the 3D object is created, and you can take advantage of that. So for example, the things you can make with mesh lights are, if you had an architectural set and the designer has put a desk lamp or ceiling lamps in there, you could find those surfaces and then turn the emission channel on in that surface property, and then the light comes directly from there. So that's a very realistic effect. So on a desk lamp, find the light bulb and turn that into an emissive object, so that actually light comes from where the bulb is, not just from where some light object is arbitrarily put there. And then you can change the intensity of the light and the size of the light and all that. Or another option would be if you create a regular primitive with DAZ Studio and then turn its surface properties to emit light. Then that mimics the effect that a photographer in a studio would get with a light box. You don't have to build the light box, all we're after is the lighting effect. Let me show you how that works. So to get started, let's go and create a primitive, like maybe a plane. I could have prepared this. I like to do these things from scratch so that you get the same impression that I get. 20 meter sphere, that's going to be our ground. Let me just go and name that. That's our ground. Awesome. Let's create another one, another primitive. This one doesn't have to be that big. Maybe I'll just make it 1 meter and it'll be our light. Can't actually see that. Let's go and make that unselectable. I'm going to call that our light, and I'm going to move it up somewhat as well so that it actually separates here. It's very difficult to see, but trust me, it's there. I'm going to spin that around in a moment. I'm also going to create one last object, which is going to be a sphere. That'll stand in for our character default properties. There we go. I'm also going to make that unselected, and my light, I'm going to move that to the side a little bit, like so. I'm going to move it up somewhat so that it's shining from the further from the top there, and then I'm going to go and turn that around like so, and maybe that'll do, and like so, maybe something like that. Is that cool? No, let's just leave it like that. That'll be nice as a starter scene. You get the impression of what happens here in a moment. Now, mesh objects, they can only be seen, or the surface properties, the emission shader, can only be seen in iRay. So let's go and switch this scene over to the iRay viewport, and we're getting terribleness once again. But that is because we've learned that already under render settings. In the environment, we've got that DAZ Studio HDRI image in there, and we're going to go and turn that off and switch that to 0. That's one thing, and the other thing was, do you remember, it is the scene lights. Switch those to never, and we get a completely black scene. That's a good start, completely black scene. Now let's focus on how we get that mesh light active. Well, that happens by selecting our light source, going onto our Surfaces tab, and in it we have the light object. So ours is called light, that was the primitive, that's the same thing here. If we open that, we get a list of surfaces that are defined on our object. So those are akin to what I've just said in more complex 3D objects. You will find several of these defined. And in our case, we only have one that's called default. So let's open that up, and that'll give us several channels now. Those channels are all kind of, I'll call them channels, and they're probably called something different, but all these things, they define different properties of our surface. So translucent, transparent, what color, what texture, what bump map, and all that. And one of them is called the emission channel. And that's currently set to black. And that means it's not emitting anything. So that's the only thing we can currently set here, just blackness, really nothing else. But if we set that to anything other than black, our object will start emitting that type of light. Observe, please. I'm going to go with white because that's just the most obvious thing. If we wanted to tweak that later, there's a couple of ways to do that. Let's get going with white and see what happens. Click OK, and We see a lot of other things open up here. There's emission temperature, two-sided emission profile, luminance and units and all that. But we have to really concentrate very hard to see any effect in our scene. It is there. If you look closely, there is a little bit of our sphere is now illuminated from my sphere. And if I turn around, I can see that my sphere is no longer completely black. It is now kind of light gray. That's a good start. So all that's happening is it is emitting light. It's just not emitting very much light. So then the obvious choice is to go to the Luminance Slider here, because we can't make it any whiter than white, but we can certainly crank up the luminance. So if I do that, gradually my emissive surface is having an effect here. It's definitely, definitely getting there. But I have to really work hard to crank this value up to something like, well, over 300,000 to have some kind of an effect. So there is a better way of doing that, or I find there's a better way of doing that. If I go and reset this value here back to 1500, which is the default, underneath luminance we have Luminance Units. And if you open that up, you have several options of setting those up. So the default is candles per square meters. There's also kilo candles, candles per square foot, candles per square centimeters. There's lumens, or lumen, I guess, and there's watt. So I'm a really simple old-fashioned guy. I like watts because it means something to me. A 60-watt light bulb probably means something different, but it kind of, I get on with knowing that, well, if whatever 15 watts is now the default, if that is too low, I'll see if whatever 100 works for me. And look at that, it actually works much better for me. Or if I wanted something much brighter, I could probably put a 500 watt thing in there, and there we go. That's kind of a smaller number that my brain is a bit simple. It kind of understands this much better. I'm going to go with 100. And explain once again that this is now the luminous efficacy, by the way. This is lumens per watt, so this is not actually watt, this is lumens per watt. It's just that to simplify things, I just understand this as something like, hey, my surface is now emitting something along the lines of a 100-watt light bulb. That's how I envision it. It's incorrect, but it works for me. So there we go. In addition to that slider, I also now have the Luminance Slider. So that's still in place. I can now go ahead and crank the intensity up or down, and that now has a much better control than me having to go like this, 20 minutes. That's just no way to live, really. So yeah, there we go. That's the Luminance Slider that can now work in accordance with the other one, if you're so inclined. I might go and pop this up to perhaps 200 so that we see this a little bit better here, and then also that you can follow along, with the scene. I can see one effect here already, that is the geometry of the sphere. If you look closely, I can see that it's just a very low poly. If you wanted to change that, no problem. You select the sphere, the total aside here, totally just throwing that in here. Head over to Edit, Object, Geometry, Convert to Sub D. Notice what happens to the sphere. Smooth as a baby's bottom. Very nice. But since this is a tutorial about lighting, let's not worry about that so much and go back to lighting. So what I can see here is the quality of the light, and that is really nice. I'm getting kind of a brightish spot, but it's not overly too much. I'm getting shadows that are defined kind of medium soft. They're still a little harsh around the edges, but they are, they're soft enough, which is a good starting point. Now let me go select my light again and show you a couple of tricks of what happens if I change my actual light object. So watch closely what happens. If I go and scale this up, if I make my light object bigger, notice that the shadows are now getting even softer. And at the same time, the brightness that is emitted from the object stays the same. It's just spread over a larger area. So that's something important to remember. If we go back to the previous one, it is now giving me a slightly brighter hotspot in the middle and less around the edges. And at the same time, the shadows are a little bit sharper. Whereas when I go and make this bigger again, then I get this the same amount of brightness over a larger surface area, and as a result I get softer shadows as well. The same holds true if I make this object smaller. Then my bright spot gets even sharper, and my shadows also get even sharper. So that's another thing to remember. But if I put that back to where it was. If I head back to my emission shader here, or my emission channel in the surface properties, and I just make the luminous efficacy, or the luminance, if I just crank that up to make the object brighter, notice that the hotspot itself or the quality of the shadows isn't actually changing. So that's really good news. That only changes if you either move the plane closer to the object or further away, or if you make the size of the object bigger or smaller in relation to where it is right now. But just changing the luminance itself, or the luminous efficacy, does not change the quality of the lighting. So that's a really good thing to remember if you're building light with that. So a favorite is if you have a character in the middle of your scene and you have a light strip on the left and the right, kind of slightly angled in on the character. Fashion photographers use that to almost eliminate shadows completely, and you have a really soft light bouncing into your character. So it's very, very nice there. So that is that with the lights. You can put as many of them around as you like. There's also another thing I wanted to make you aware of. If I go and change that back to the default here, I'm going to go and turn that light slightly, kind of, just less of an angle, and I'm going to go bring that down a little bit and watch what happens on the other side of the light. So right now what we can see is that my light is certainly emitting light to my object, but I can also see that the light is emitting light the other way. That's an interesting concept, so I just wanted to let you know that it exists, and so by default the object will emit light to both sides, and we have a way of switching that off. So that's this little job here, two-sided light. If I switch that off, watch what happens to the light. It now stops emitting from both sides, it only emits it to one side. And the side that DAZ Studio decides to emit light from is in fact the normals. I don't know if we've really spoken about that. It's kind of an intricate term. It took me a while to understand what a normal actually is, or the fact that that is in fact a term. The normal on an object describes a single side. It is not a real lens actually, it is a coffee cup, would you believe it? Bought that at the Kodak Museum in Rochester. Phenomenal place, you should go one day. It's amazing. The normal of a 3D surface is literally an arbitrary description of surface number one. The other way, this is a rubber seal here by the way, this would not be the normal. So the 3D polygons can only have one side that is the normal, and the other side is not the normal. I don't know who picked that term, but it's, that's just what it is. So the light is emitted here where the normals are, and if you put two-sided light on, then it's emitted from both sides, from where the normals are and where they're not, and if you switch it off, then it's only emitted from the side of the normals. How can you tell what side normals are? Well, that's difficult in DAZ Studio, but in case of our plane, it is where the y-axis is facing. That's where the normals are. In our case of the sphere, which is also a primitive object, the normals are facing to the outside. So if you could draw little arrows into the direction of the normals, they will be like spiky shooting out. And the inside of a 3D object, which is not seen, is not the normal, so there's really no need to define that. I guess that's how it works. One last thing I wanted to make you aware of while we're talking about things that you can do with mesh lights. If I just switch two-sided lighting off and I turn my camera around to about here, there may be moments in which you frame up your object that you're lighting up and you say, hey, I really don't want to see my light emitter here. That's not something I want to see. Just want to see the effect it has, but I don't want this black square or whatever it is in the way. I don't want that. I don't want to see that. There is a way to do that. It's a slight bit of a hack, but we can make it work, and it's actually fairly easy to do. We need to lower the transparency of our light emitting object, and that is also done as a surface property. Good thing we're talking about that, by the way. So on the surface tab, just underneath emission, we have the geometry tab. And if we open that, the first item that comes up is the cutout opacity. And that is literally how opaque that object or how transparent the object is. Opacity set to 1 means it's 100% opaque. That means you can't see through it. Set it to 0 and it becomes more or less invisible. Look at that. So the lower I make it, the more I can see through it. It's kind of interesting for, you know, glass, windows and water, and that all works that way because it's not completely clear, otherwise it'd be invisible, like the Invisible Man is invisible. I guess he wishes he would have a little bit of opacity in him. But hey, the thing is, what I wanted to say is the more you make that small here, this number, you will still be able to see a little bit of an outline. But if you turn that to 0, there's no more light. So that's kind of an intricate thing that we have to work around. If you make it really, really low, you will still be able to see that there's a bit of an object there. But if you set it to complete 0, then the object is gone. So I guess the render engine doesn't render the object anymore. Luckily for us, there's an easy way around it. We have to turn this into the smallest cutout opacity parameter that DAZ Studio accepts, which happens to be 0.0001. That is the smallest number this interface accepts. And if you set it to that, it is more or less completely gone and transparent, but you can now shoot through it, and it's almost like the object is no longer there. All we can see is the effect that it has. So it is still in the scene, but we can no longer see it. So that's exciting. That's something else I wanted to show you with mesh lights, just so that you know. Now, my Patreon supporters, they have access to something that I call DAZ Studio Light Starter. That's kind of a mesh light starting kit. You can make kind of cool portraits with it very quickly out of the box. If you're a Patreon supporter, you can look that up under the DAZ freebies. It's there. And if you're not a Patreon supporter, perhaps this is a great time to sign up. Any tier will get this freebie, and it's just a nice little thing in which I've set up 2 of these strip lights with DAZ Studio, just like I've explained it just now, and it makes your portraits kind of, it's a good way to get started with a new portrait. Put in the character, put some clothing on, put a pose in, and frame up through the camera that I've given you, and hit render. That is it. So that's all I know about mesh lights. There's a lot that you can do. Some creators have set them up. If you buy a scene over on DAZ3D.com, then you will see that more and more iRay set creators have already put lights in there. They've defined surface properties just like that. But if you're using older content, those light sources are probably not defined, but it's fairly easy to go through them and find what the light sources are, what the light bulbs are, turn them into emissive shaders, and then that's it. Oh yes, there's one thing. While I was rehearsing this, while I was running through this, there is something I just wanted to throw in here, much like, you know, that this is a coffee cup rather than a lens, or how you can change the geometry of the object, put some sub D on there. There is a thing that some people get confused about what's a shader and what's a material preset. A shader, and I just thought, you know, it pops into my head, I'm just going to explain that to you right here. And a shader is a collection of surface settings that can be applied to basically any object. So if we head over here to the presets, we get a shaders tab, and then we get all the iRay shaders here. So I can now go and drag some blue car paint onto my sphere if I were to make it selectable. I think I've just set that to the light. That was not exactly what I wanted to do. I can use a different color if I wanted to. So that is a collection of surface parameters that will work on any surface. But if my object were to have multiple types of surfaces, like this one and that one and that one and that one, I could define or drag on a shader for each of these surfaces that are defined, and then I can save on a per object basis a collection of shaders that will tell DAZ Studio where each shader needs to go, and that is a material preset. So that's the difference. The shader can be applied to a surface, and a material preset is a collection of surfaces on a per object basis. So a material preset for this isn't going to work on a character, for example, and vice versa. A material preset for an item of clothing A isn't going to work on clothing B, or a character, or this coffee mug. Bit of useless information that I thought I'd throw it in. Thank you so much for watching. In the next episode, we're going to talk about HDRI images and lights that you can build with them, commonly known as IBL lights. So that is how you light up a scene with a picture rather than light objects. Join me for that. Other than that, have a wonderful day. Take care.